E.P. Alexander, a 28-year-old Georgian and West Pointer, had been up all night and hard at work all morning, supervising the movement into position of the 80 guns of the 1st Corps. By noon, the job had been completed. The batteries were disposed along their mile-long arc, southward from the command post to the peach orchard and beyond, and the colonel, having taken time to breakfast on a crust of cornbread and a cup of sweet potato coffee, was awaiting notification to fire the prearranged 2-gun signal that would open the 143-gun bombardment. Young as he was, he'd been given vital assignments from the outset of the war and had fought in all the Army's major battles, first as Beauregard's signal officer, then as Johnston's chief of ordnance, and later as commander of an artillery battalion under Longstreet. Serving in these various capacities, he had contributed largely to the curtain-raising victory at Manassas, as well as to the subsequent effectiveness of Confederate firepower. And since his transfer from staff to line, he'd been winning a reputation as perhaps the best artillerist in Lee's army, despite the flashier performances of men like Latimer and Pelham. His had been the guns that defended Marye's Heights at Fredericksburg and accompanied Jackson on the flank march at Chancellorsville. However, his most challenging assignment came today from Longstreet, who instructed him to prepare and conduct the 1st Corps' share of the bombardment preceding the infantry attack. When the objective was shifted northward along Cemetery Ridge, after the early morning conference between Lee and Longstreet, Alexander rearranged his dispositions as inoffensively as possible, seeking to hide his intentions from the enemy lookouts on the heights, and took care to keep his crews from getting into bunches. He listened with disapproval as Hill's 60-odd guns began their premature cannonade northward along Seminary Ridge, and would not allow his own to join the action lest they give away the positions he'd taken such pains to conceal. As the uproar subsided and was followed by the silence that came over the field at noon, he received an even greater shock from his own Corps commander, who informed him that he would be required to make the decision not only as to when the infantry attack was to begin, but also as to whether it was to be launched at all. If the artillery fire does not have the effect to drive off the enemy or greatly demoralize him so as to make our effort pretty certain, Longstreet wrote in a message delivered by an aide, I would prefer that you should not advise Pickett to make the charge. I shall rely a great deal upon your judgment to determine the matter, and shall expect you to let General Pickett know when the moment offers. Alexander experienced a violent reaction to this sudden descent of command responsibility. Until that moment, though I fully recognized the strength of the enemy's position, he recalled years later, I had not doubted that we would carry it, in my confidence that Lee was ordering it. But here was a proposition that I should decide the question. Overwhelming reasons against the assault at once seemed to stare me in the face. He replied at some length, declining the heavy burden old Peter appeared to be attempting to unload. General, he protested, I will only be able to judge of the effect of our fire on the enemy by his return fire, for his infantry is but little exposed to view, and the smoke will obscure the whole field. If, as I infer from your note, there is any alternative to this attack, it should be carefully considered before opening our fire, for it will take all the artillery ammunition we have left to test this one thoroughly, and if the result is unfavorable, we will have none left for another effort. And even if this is entirely successful, it can only be so at a very bloody cost. Longstreet's answer was not long in coming. Having failed to persuade the colonel to join him in resubmitting his protest that the charge was bound to fail, which was what he'd been suggesting between the lines of his rather turgid note, he merely rephrased the essential portion of what he'd said before. Colonel, he wrote, the intention is to advance the infantry if the artillery has the desired effect of driving the enemies off, or having other effects such as to warrant us in making the attack. When that moment arrives, advise General P, and of course advance such artillery as you can use in aiding the attack. This left one small loophole, if the artillery has a desired effect, and Alexander saw it. No cannonade had ever driven Union batteries from a prepared position, and he certainly had no confidence that this one would accomplish that result. But before he replied this second time, he decided to confer with two men of higher authority than his own. The first was his fellow Georgian Ambrose Wright, who had stormed the enemy ridge the day before, achieving at least a temporary penetration, and could therefore testify as to the difficulty involved. "What do you think of it?" Alexander asked him. "Is it as hard to get there as it looks?" Wright spoke frankly. "The trouble's not going there," he said. "I was there with my brigade yesterday. There's a place where you can get breath and reform. The trouble is to stay there after you get there, for the whole Yankee army's there in a bunch." Alexander took this to mean that the attack would succeed if it was heavily supported, and he assumed that Lee had seen to that. Thus reassured, he went to see how Pickett was reacting to the assignment. He not only found him calm and confident, but also gathered that the ringleted Virginian thought himself in luck to have the chance. So the colonel returned to his post just north of the peach orchard and got off a reply to old Peter's second message. "When our fire is at its best," he wrote briefly, even curtly, "I will advise General Pickett to advance." Word came soon afterwards from Longstreet. "Let the batteries open. Order great care and precision in firing." By prearrangement, the two-gun signal was given by a battery near the center. According to a Gettysburg civilian, a professor of mathematics and inveterate taker of notes, the first shot broke the stillness at exactly 1:07, following which there was an unpropitious pause occasioned by a misfire. Nettle, the battery officer, signaled the third of his four pieces, and the second shot rang out. "As suddenly as an organ strikes up in church," Alexander would recall, "the grand roar followed from all the guns." The firing was by salvos for deliberate precision, and as the 2-mile curve of metal came alive in response to the long-awaited signal, the individual pieces bucking and fuming in rapid sequence from right to left, a Federal cannoneer across the valley was reminded of the powder snakes we boys used to touch off on the 4th of July. To a man, the lounging bluecoats, whose only concern up to then had been their hunger and the heat, both of which were oppressive, knew what the uproar meant as soon as it began. "Down! Down!" they shouted, diving for whatever cover they could find on the rocky forward slope of Cemetery Ridge. By now the rebel fire was general, though still by salvos within the 4-gun units, and to Hunt, who was up on Little Round Top at the time, the sight was indescribably grand. All their batteries were soon covered with smoke, through which the flames were incessant, whilst the air seemed filled with shells whose sharp explosions, with the hurtling of their fragments, formed a running accompaniment to the deep roar of the guns. That was how it looked and sounded to a coldly professional eye and ear sighted well above the conflict, so to speak. But to Gibbon, down on the ridge where the shots were landing, the bombardment was the most infernal pandemonium it has ever been my fortune to look upon. One of his soldiers, caught like him in the sudden deluge of fire and whining splinters, put it simpler. The air was all murderous iron, he declared years later, apparently still somewhat surprised at finding that he had survived it. In point of fact, despite the gaudiness of what might be called the fireworks aspect of the thing, casualties were few among the infantry. For the most part, they had stone walls to crouch behind. Moreover, they were disposed well down the slope, and this, as it turned out, afforded them the best protection of all. At first, the fire was highly accurate, but as it continued, both the ridge and the batteries at opposite ends of the trajectory were blanketed in smoke, so that the rebel gunners were firing blind, just as Alexander had foretold. As the trails dug in, the tubes gained elevation, and the shell burst crept uphill until finally almost all of the projectiles were either landing on the crest, where most of the close support artillery was posted, or grazing it to explode in the Rearwood Valley. Quartermaster hunters, the crouching front-line soldiers called these last, deriving much satisfaction from the thought that what was meant for them was making havoc among the normally easy-living men of the rear echelon. Havoc was by no means too strong a word, especially in reference to what was occurring around and in Army headquarters. The small white cottage Meade had commandeered immediately in rear of that portion of the ridge on which the rebels had been told to mass their hottest fire became untenable in short order. Its steps were carried away by a direct hit at the outset, along with the supports of the porch, which then collapsed. Inside the house, a solid shot crashed through a door and barely missed the commanding general himself, while another plowed through the roof and garret, filling the lower rooms with flying splinters. Meade and his staff retired to the yard, where 16 of their horses lay horribly mangled, still tethered to a fence. Then moved into a nearby barn where Butterfield was nicked by a shell fragment, and finally transferred in a body all the way to Powers Hill, where Slocum had set up the night before. Here at last they found a measure of the safety they'd been seeking, but they were about as effectively removed from what was happening back on Cemetery Ridge, or was about to happen, as if they'd taken refuge on one of the mountains of the moon. Meanwhile, other rear area elements had been catching it nearly as hard. Down and across both the Tawnytown Road and the Baltimore Pike, fugitives of all kinds, clerks and orderlies, ambulance drivers and mess personnel, supernumeraries and just plain skulkers, were streaming east and south to escape the Holocaust, adding greatly to the panic in their haste and disregard for order. Nor were such non-combatants the only ones involved in the confusion and the bloodshed. Returning to its post on the left, the 6th Corps Brigade that had been lent to Slocum that morning to assist in the retaking of Culp's Hill — he had not had to use it after all — was caught on the road and lost 23 killed and wounded before it cleared the zone of fire. More important still, tactically speaking, the parked guns of the reserve artillery and the wagons of the ammunition train, drawn up in assumed safety on the lee side of the ridge, came under heavy bombardment, losing men and horses and caissons in the fury of the shell bursts, and had to be shifted half a mile southward, away from the point where they would be needed later. All in all, though it was more or less clear already that the gray artillerists were going to fail in their attempt to drive the blue defenders from the ridge, they had accomplished much with their faulty gunnery, including the disruption of Army headquarters, the wounding of the Chief of Staff, and the displacement of the artillery reserve, not to mention a good deal of incidental slaughter among the rearward fugitives who had not intended to take any part in the fighting anyhow. Unwittingly, and in fact through carelessness and error, the Confederates had invented the box barrage of World War I, still 50-odd years in the future, whereby a chosen sector of the enemy line was isolated for attack. Awaiting that attack, crouched beneath what seemed a low, impenetrable dome of screaming metal overarching the forward slope of the isolated 1,000 yards of ridge, were 3 depleted divisions under Hancock, 6 brigades containing some 5,700 infantry effectives, or roughly half the number about to be sent against them. This disparity of forces, occupying or aimed at the intended point of contact, was largely the fault of Meade, whose overall numerical superiority was offset by the fact that his anticipations did not include the threat which this small segment of his army was about to be exposed to. Despite his midnight prediction to Gibbon that today's main rebel effort would be made against your front, he not only had sent him no reinforcements, he had not even taken the precaution of seeing that any were made immediately available by posting them in proximity to that portion of the line. Daylight had brought a change of mind, a change of fears. He no longer considered that the point of danger, partly because his artillery enjoyed an unobstructed field of fire from there, but mostly because he recollected that his opponent was not partial to attacks against the center. As the morning wore on and Ewell failed to make headway on the right, Meade began to be convinced that Lee was planning to assault his left, and he kept his largely unused reserve, the big 6th Corps, massed in the direction of the Round Tops. At 12:20, when Slocum sent word that he had gained a decided advantage on my front and hoped to be able to spare 1 or 2 brigades to help you on some other part of the line, the Northern commander was gratified by the evidence of staunchness, but he took no advantage of the offer. Then presently, under the distracted fury of the Confederate bombardment, which drove him in rapid, headlong sequence from house to yard, from yard to barn, and then from barn to hilltop, he apparently forgot it. Whatever defense of that critical 1,000 yards of ridge was going to be made would have to be made by the men who occupied it. They amounted in all to 26 regiments, including 2 advanced as skirmishers, and their line ran half a mile due south from Ziegler's Grove, where Cemetery Hill fell off and Cemetery Ridge began. Gibbon held the center with 3 brigades, flanked on the left and right by Doubleday and Hayes, respectively with 1 and 2 brigades. Gibbon had just over and Hayes just under 2,000 infantry apiece, while Doubleday had about 1,700. For most of the long waiting time preceding the full-scale Confederate bombardment, these 5,700 defenders had been hearing the Slocum-Johnson struggle for Culp's Hill, barely a mile away. At first it made them edgy, occurring as it did almost directly in their rear, but as it gradually receded and diminished, they gained confidence. Finally, it sputtered to a stop and was succeeded by a lull, which in turn was interrupted by the brief but lively skirmish for possession of the house and barn down on the floor of the western valley. The half-hour rebel cannonade that followed accomplished nothing one way or another, except perhaps as a bellow of protest at the outcome of the fight. By contrast, hard on the heels of this, the midday silence was profound. At noon, it became as still as a Sabbath day, a Blue Observer later wrote. He and his fellows scarcely knew what to make of this abrupt cessation, in which even the querulous skirmishers held their fire. It was a queer sight to see men look at each other without speaking, another would recall. The change was so great, men seemed to go on tiptoe, not knowing how to act. This lasted a full hour, during which they tried to improvise shelter from the rays of the sun and sought relief from the pangs of hunger. There was precious little of either shade or food there on the naked ridge, but shortly after 1 o'clock, when the curtain of silence was suddenly ripped to tatters by the roar of what seemed to be all the guns in the world, they forgot the discomforts of heat and hunger, acute as these had been, and concentrated instead on a scramble for cover behind the low stone walls. However, as a pattern of shell bursts moved up the slope and stayed there, except for an occasional round, that is, that tumbled and fell short, they found that once they grew accustomed to the whoosh and flutter of metal just overhead, the bombardment was not nearly so bad as it seemed. All we had to do was flatten out a little thinner, one of the earth-hugging soldiers afterwards explained, and our empty stomachs did not prevent that. Despite the feeling of security that came from lying low, it seemed to another crouching there that nothing 4 feet from the ground could live. Presently, however, he and his companions all along that blasted 1,000 yards of front were given unmistakable proof that such was not the case, at least so far as one man was concerned. As the bombardment thundered toward crescendo, they were startled to see Hancock, mounted on a fine black horse and trailed by most of his staff, riding the full length of his line amid the hiss and thud of plunging shells and solids. He rode slowly, a mounted orderly beside him, displaying the swallow-tailed Corps guidon. Resisting the impulse to weave or bob when he felt the breath of near misses on his face, the general only stopped once in the course of his excursion, and that was when his horse, with less concern for show than for survival, became unmanageable and forced him to take over the more tractable mount of an aide, who perhaps was not unhappy at the exchange, since it permitted him to retire from the procession. Hancock resumed his ride at the same deliberate pace, combining a ramrod stiffness of backbone with that otherwise easy grace of manner expected of top-ranking officers under fire, a highly improbable mixture of contempt and disregard for and of the rebel attempt to snuff out the one life he had, whereby the men under him, as one of them rather floridly explained, found courage to endure the pelting of the pitiless gale. Intent on giving an exemplary performance, he would no more be deterred by friendly counsel than he would swerve to avoid the enemy shells that whooshed around him. When a brigadier ventured a protest, "General, the Corps commander ought not to risk his life that way," Hancock replied curtly. There are times when a Corps commander's life does not count, and continued his ride along the line of admiring soldiers who cheered him lustily from behind their low stone walls, but were careful all the same to remain in prone or kneeling positions while they did so. Another high-ranking Federal was riding better than 3 times that length of line at the same time, but he did so less by way of staging a general show, as Hancock was doing to bolster the spirits of the men along his portion of the front, than by way of assuring conformity with Army regulations. In the attack, these regulations stated, the artillery is employed to silence the batteries that protect the enemy's position. In the defense, it is better to direct its fire on the advancing troops. It was the second of these 2 statements that he replied, and no one knew this better than Henry Hunt, who had been an artillery instructor at West Point and had spent the past 2 years in practical application on the field of battle of the theories he'd expounded in the classroom. On Cemetery Hill, on Little Round Top, and along the ridge that ran between them, he had 20 batteries in position, just over 100 guns that could be brought to bear on the shallow western valley and the ridge at its far rim. Just now there were no advancing troops for the long line of Union metal to direct its fire on. But Hunt was convinced there soon would be, and his first concern, after observing from his lofty perch at the south end of the line the indescribably grand beginning of the Confederate bombardment, was that his cannoneers not burn up too much of their long-range ammunition and counter-battery fire, lest they run short before the rebel infantry made its appearance. Accordingly, after instructing B.F. Rittenhouse to keep up a deliberate fire with his 6-gun battery on Little Round Top, Hunt rode down onto the lower end of Cemetery Ridge and ordered Freeman McGilvery, commanding 7 batteries of 37 guns from the artillery reserve, to refrain from taking up the enemy challenge until the proper time. The same instructions went to John G. Hazard, commanding the 6th 2nd Corps batteries, whose 29 guns were posted north of there, above and below the little umbrella-shaped clump of trees. On Cemetery Hill, completing the 2-mile ride from Little Round Top, Hunt repeated what he'd told Rittenhouse at the outset. T.W. Osborne was to keep up a deliberate counter-battery fire with the 29 guns of his 6th 11th Corps battery. By this arrangement, 1/3 of the 101 guns were to do what they could to disconcert the rebel gunners by maintaining a crossfire from the high-sided extremities of the Federal position, while the remaining 2/3 kept silent along the comparatively low-lying ridge that ran between them. However, it did not work out that way entirely. Completing his slow ride along his 1,000-yard portion of the front, Hancock observed that his cannoneers were idle, if idle was quite the word for men who were hugging the earth amid a deluge of shells, and promptly countermanded Hunt's instructions. He did so, he explained afterwards, because he believed that his infantry needed the deep voice encouragement of the guns posted in close support on the crest of the ridge directly in their rear. Whatever comfort the blue foot soldiers derived from the roar and rumble in response to the fire of the rebel guns down in the valley, Hunt watched with disapproval as the half-dozen 2nd Corps batteries came alive. But there was nothing he could do about it, since the Corps commander had every right to do as he thought best with his own guns, no matter what any and all staff specialists might advise. All this time the Confederates kept firing, exploding caissons, dismounting guns, and maiming so many cannoneers, particularly in those batteries adjacent to the little clump of trees, that replacements had to be furnished from nearby infantry outfits, supposedly on a volunteer basis, but actually by a hard-handed form of conscription. Volunteers are wanted to man the battery, a Massachusetts captain told his company. Every man is to go of his own free will and accord. Come out here, John Doherty, McGivern, and you, Corrigan, and work these guns. For a solid hour, the bombardment did not slacken, and when another half hour was added to this, still with no abatement, McGilvery ordered his 7 batteries to open fire at last, convinced that by now the rebels must be getting low on ammunition and would have to launch their infantry attack, if they were going to launch it at all, before his own supply ran low. That was about 2:30. All the surviving Union guns were in action, bucking and roaring along the whole 2 miles of line. From down in the valley, Alexander peered through the billowing smoke, and it seemed to him that both enemy heights and the connecting ridge were blazing like a volcano. On Cemetery Hill, where he availed himself of the excellent observation post established by the 11th Corps Chief of Artillery, Hunt watched with gratification this tangible proof that for all its prolonged fury, the rebel cannonade had failed to drive his gun crews from their pieces or the guns themselves from their assigned positions. It occurred to him, however, that in the light of this evidence, as plain from below as from above, the Confederates might not attempt their infantry assault at all, and he considered this regrettable. Standing beside him, Osborne suddenly asked, "Does Meade consider an attack of the enemy desirable?" When Hunt replied that the Army commander had expressed a fervent hope that the rebels would try just that, and he had no fear of the result, the Major added, "If this is so, why not let them out while we are all in good condition? I would cease fire at once, and the enemy could reach but one conclusion, that of our being driven from the hill." Hunt thought this over briefly, then agreed. Moreover, while the batteries on the hill fell silent one by one, he rode down onto Cemetery Ridge to increase the effectiveness of the ruse by passing the word along to the remaining two-thirds of his guns. At closer range, however, he found the 2nd Corps batteries so badly mauled by the rebel cannonade and so low on ammunition that he decided they might as well use up what few long-range rounds were still on hand. For example, Alonzo Cushing's battery, posted just north of the clump of trees, had only 3 of its 6 guns still in working order and only 2 of these in action, casualties having reduced the number of cannoneers to barely enough for 2 slim crews. Cushing himself, a 22-year-old West Pointer from Wisconsin, had twice been hit by fragments of exploding shells, one of which had struck him in the crotch and groin. Despite the pain, he refused to leave the field or relinquish his command, and Hunt let him stay, together with his handful of survivors. A Rhode Island battery just south of the clump was in even worse shape. Its ammunition practically exhausted, all of its officers dead or wounded, and barely enough men left to serve the 3 remaining guns. Hunt took a quick look at the wreckage and gave the survivors permission to withdraw, which they did in a rather helter-skelter fashion, being leaderless, but took their 3 guns with them. Riding on south, Hunt passed the cease-firing order along to McGillivray, down near the far end of the ridge, and finally to Rittenhouse, whose 6 guns had been firing all the while from Little Round Top. When the weary and badly cut-up batteries of the 2nd Corps had gotten off their few remaining rounds, thus adding to the effectiveness of the pretense by giving the impression that the guns were being knocked out group by group, spasmodically, the whole Union line fell silent under the continuing rain of rebel projectiles. That was about 2:45, and it soon became apparent that the ruse had worked, at least in part. Within another 5 or 10 minutes, the Confederates also stopped firing, and what Osborne later referred to as a singularly depressing silence settled over the field. Whether the ruse had worked entirely would not be known until the enemy infantry started forward across the valley, but the Federal cannoneers were taking no chances that it had failed. The cooling tubes were swabbed to remove the gritty residue of powder and thus prepare them for the rapid-fire work that lay ahead, while in those batteries that had used up all their long-range ammunition, the pieces were carefully loaded with canister. 44-year-old Alex Hayes, a Pennsylvanian like his Corps and Army commanders, was certain that the Rebs would soon be coming through the screening smoke. "Now, boys, look out. You'll see some fun," he called to the men of his 2 brigades posted north of the clump of trees. In confirmation of his prediction, shortly after 3 o'clock, Warren wigwagged a message from the Little Round Top signal station, which afforded a clear view beyond the hump of earth that Sickles had claimed and lost the day before. "They are moving out to attack." Presently, all along the bend and shank of the Union fishhook, the waiting troops could see for themselves, through or below the rifting, lifting smoke, that what Warren had signaled was true. "Here they come," men exclaimed as they caught sight of the long gray lines moving toward them across the shallow basin enclosed by the 2 ridges. Reactions to this confrontation varied. "Thank God, here comes the infantry," one exuberant bluecoat cried. Though it was obvious at a glance that the attackers, moving steadily forward under their red and blue flags, outnumbered the defenders by no less than 2 to 1, he and others like him looked forward to the slaughter, anticipating a Fredericksburg in reverse. A New Yorker, on the other hand, remembering the sight 2 days later, wrote in a home letter, "Beautiful, gloriously beautiful did that vast array appear in the lovely little valley." Then he and his fellows, first the cannoneers, who took up their work with a will, and then the foot soldiers, no less eager, settled down to the task of transforming those well-dressed long gray lines into something far from beautiful. There they came, and for them advancing eastward over the gently undulating floor of the shallow valley, the relief of tension was as great as it was for the men awaiting their arrival on the ridge just under a mile across the way. In fact, if a comparison of losses was any measure of the strain, it was probably greater. The Federal infantry had suffered a good deal less from the bombardment than the Federal artillery had done. But for the Confederates, whose infantry was posted behind instead of in front of their fuming line of metal, it was the other way around. Both sides were overshooting, with the unequal result that the eastbound overs spared the bluecoats on the forward slope of their ridge, whereas a high proportion of their long shots landed squarely in the ranks of the gray soldiers drawn up to await the order to advance. Fewer than 200 of the former were hit, while the latter suffered approximately twice that number of casualties in the course of the nearly 2-hour-long exchange. Such a tornado of projectiles it has seldom been the fortune or misfortune of anyone to see, one of Pickett's veterans declared. It seemed to go on forever, he recalled, under a high, hard, hot blue sky that soon became lurid with flame and murky with smoke, until presently the sun was in a red eclipse, shadowing the earth as with a funeral pall, though this gave little relief from the heat, which was even more oppressive here in the swale than it was for the blue soldiers on the high ground in the distance. "Many a poor fellow thought his time had come," another grayback wrote. "Great, big, stout-hearted men prayed, loudly, too. Stretcher bearers were kept on the run, answering the sudden high-pitched yells of the wounded up and down the sweaty, mile-long formation. One of Kemper's men, attempting later to describe what he had been through, finally gave it up and contented himself with a 4-word description of his ordeal by fire. It was simply awful. Even so, not all the accustomed butternut risibility was suppressed. Near one badly pounded company, when a rabbit suddenly broke from a clump of bushes and went bounding for the rear, "Run, old hare," a man called after him. If I was an old hare, I'd run too. Officers of rank, commanders of the 9 brigades and 3 divisions, kept moving among the waiting troops, seeking to encourage them by example, much as Hancock was doing at the same time across the way. However, the response was somewhat different on this side of the valley. When Longstreet rode along the front of Pickett's division and a round shot plowed the ground immediately under his horse's nose, the general kept the startled animal under control, as quiet as an old farmer riding over his plantation on a Sunday morning, and looked neither to the right or left. Thus an admiring captain described the scene, but the men themselves, apparently resentful of the implication that they needed steadying, had a different reaction. "You get your old fool head knocked off," one of them called out to him, while others shouted angrily, "We'll fight without you leading us." Similarly, in Armistead's brigade, where the troops had been instructed to remain prone throughout the bombardment, there was resentment that their commander felt it necessary to move erect among them with encouraging remarks and a showy disregard for the projectiles whooshing past him. One soldier rose in protest, and when Armistead ordered him to lie back down, pointed out that he was only following his general's example. Armistead, however, like his friend Hancock on the ridge across the valley, had a ready answer. "Yes, but never mind me," he said. "We want men with guns in their hands." Out front on the low bulge of earth crowned by the peach orchard Barksdale's men had seized the day before, Alexander had been watching all this time for evidence that the cannonade was accomplishing its mission, which was to wreck the enemy batteries or drive them from the ridge that was the infantry's objective. So far, although an hour had elapsed since his guns first opened, the young colonel had seen little that encouraged him to believe that he was going to succeed in his assignment. Volcano-like, the enemy ridge and its two flanking heights not only continued to return the fire directed at them, but presently that return fire grew more furious than ever, despite an occasional burst of flame and the sudden resulting erection of a pillar of smoke whose base marked the former location of a caisson. Earlier, Wright and Pickett had persuaded him that all Lee intended would be accomplished in short order. After more than an hour of steady firing, however, Alexander's doubts returned in strength. Moreover, the pressure of command responsibility grew heavier by the minute, until at last, as he wrote later, it seemed madness to order a column in the middle of a hot July day to undertake an advance of 3/4 of a mile over open ground against the center of that line. What was worse, another half hour reduced the ammunition supply to the point where the attack would have to be launched without delay if it was to have artillery support. Shortly after 2:30, with the counter-battery fire approaching crescendo, Alexander dispatched a courier with a note informing Pickett of the situation. "If you are to come at all, you must come at once," he told him, "or we will not be able to support you as we ought. But the enemy's fire has not slackened materially, and there are still 18 guns firing from the cemetery." This last had reference to the little clump of trees which the colonel had been told was the cemetery, and though he was mistaken in this, his estimate as to the number of guns still active in that vicinity was accurate enough. And presently, as he kept peering through the smoke to catch the slightest encouraging reaction by the blue gunners in the distance, he observed with gratification that the Federals had ceased firing on the hill to the left, and soon afterwards he spotted a rearward displacement by some guns near the critical center. It was the battered Rhode Islanders whom Hunt had given permission to withdraw their 3 surviving pieces, but in his elation, for the enemy fire continued to slacken all along the ridge and on both adjoining heights, Alexander persuaded himself that the withdrawal had been considerably more substantial than it was in fact. In other words, the blue ruse had worked far better than its authors would have any way of knowing until they saw the long gray lines of infantry advancing. He got off a second note to Pickett, hard on the heels of the first. "For God's sake, come quick. The 18 guns have gone. Come quick, or my ammunition will not let me support you properly." Pickett by then had already acted on the first of the 2 dispatches. Glad to receive anything that might end the strain of waiting, he mounted his horse and rode at once to Longstreet, whom he found sitting on a snake rail fence out front, observing the bombardment. Dismounting, he handed him the note. Old Peter read it deliberately but said nothing. "General, shall I advance?" Pickett asked eagerly. Longstreet, who later explained, "My feelings had so overcome me that I could not speak for fear of betraying my want of confidence," responded with a silent nod. That was enough for the jaunty, long-haired Virginian. "I'm going to move forward, sir," he said. Then he saluted, remounted, and rode back to join his men. Front and center of his division, he delivered from horseback what one of his officers called a brief animated address, which only those soldiers nearest him could hear, but which ended on a ringing note. "Up, men, and to your posts. Don't forget today that you are from old Virginia." There was, however, no disconcerting haste as the troops were placed in attack formation. For the most part, they simply rose to their feet and began to dress their regimental lines, while their colonels passed among them, repeating the instructions received from above. Advance slowly with arms at will. No cheering, no firing, no breaking from common to quick step. Dress on the center. In at least one outfit, a survivor would recall, one of the captains led in the singing of a hymn, and a white-haired chaplain offered prayer. Nor was the step-off itself unduly precipitate. Pettigrew gave the signal on the left to the new leader of his old brigade. "Now, Colonel, for the honor of the good old North State, forward." The advance was somewhat ragged at first, as if the Virginians, Mississippians, Alabamians, and Tennesseans of his division supposed that the spoken order only applied to the Carolinians. But the laggard brigades soon restored their alignment by double-timing to catch up. Meanwhile, in the wooded swale to the south, others had taken up the cry. Armstead, whose brigade comprised the supporting line on the right, as Trimble's two did on the left, did not neglect the opportunity afforded for another display of determination. "Sergeant, are you going to plant those colors on the enemy works today?" he asked a nearby color bearer. And when the sergeant gave the staunch, expected answer, "I will try, sir, and if mortal man can do it, it shall be done," the general removed his wide-brimmed black felt hat, placed it on the point of his sword, and raised it high for all to see, shouting in a voice that carried from flank to flank of his brigade, "Attention, 2nd Battalion, the Battalion of Direction. Forward, guide, center, march," and led the way. Beyond the left, within the lower limits of the town of Gettysburg, onlookers from Rodes's division, seeing Pettigrew's troops emerge from the woods and begin their downhill march into the valley, called out to the Federal surgeons who had remained behind to tend the captured wounded of their army, "There go the men who'll go through your damn Yankee line for you." Longstreet had preceded them out to the line of guns and was conferring with Alexander. Pleased though he had been at seeing the enemy artillery first slacked and cease its fire, he was anything but pleased when he saw his own guns follow suit immediately after he gave Pickett the nod that would send him forth to what he himself had predicted would be slaughter. But his greatest surprise was at Alexander's explanation that he had suspended firing in order to save ammunition, being doubtful whether enough remained on hand for proper support of the infantry on its way across the valley. Old Peter was plainly horrified, despite the colonel's earlier statement that the supply was limited. "Go and stop Pickett right where he is and replenish your ammunition," he exclaimed. Now it was Alexander's turn to be surprised. "We can't do that, sir," he protested. "The train has but little. It would take an hour to distribute it, and meanwhile the enemy would improve the time." Longstreet made no reply to this. For a long moment he stood there saying nothing. Then he spoke, slowly and with deep emotion. "I do not want to make this charge," he said. "I do not see how it can succeed. I would not make it now, but the General Lee has ordered it and expects it." With that he stopped, gripped by indecision and regret, though in point of fact he'd been given no authority to halt the attack, even if he had so chosen. The young artillerist volunteered nothing further. Just then, however, the issue was settled for once and all by the appearance of Garnett's and Kemper's brigades from the swale behind the guns. Garnett was mounted, having been granted special permission to ride because of his injured knee and feverish condition, and Alexander went back to meet him. They'd been friends out on the plains in the old army. Apparently the Virginian was experiencing a chill just now, for he wore an old blue overcoat buttoned close to his throat despite the July heat. Alexander walked beside the horse until they reached the slope leading down to the Emmitsburg Road and the Union Ridge beyond. There he stopped and watched his friend ride on. "Goodbye," he called across the widening gap, and he added, as if by afterthought, "Good luck."